Now let's bring in our very special guest, Secretary of Housing and Urban Development, Dr. Ben Carson. Before he was sworn as Secretary, Dr. Carson spent nearly 30 years as Director of Pediatric Neurosurgery at Johns Hopkins Children's Center. Dr. Carson has also received dozens of honors and awards for his achievements, including the Presidential Medal of Freedom, the nation's highest civilian honor. Dr. Carson, thanks so much for being here with us today on the Income Generation.
Thanks for having me. It's a pleasure.
So, okay, I don't even know where to start here. I guess, first of all, what are some of the biggest challenges that you're seeing right now with the reopening? I mean, there's things like sports centers, major events, transportation. How do you think the best way is going to be to handle some of these things that could potentially bring on a second wave of infections if we go back too soon?
Well, we have a plethora of challenges. There's no question about that. But perhaps the biggest is that people will think that everything is okay and forget about some of the social distancing, the hand washing, the careful personal hygiene that has been largely responsible for tamping down, the ferocity of this epidemic. And we have to realize that what we're doing is actually learning how to live with the virus, because we basically have a couple of choices. We can say, let's all just shelter in place until there's no more virus. And of course, there'll be no more economy either. And more people will die than would have died from the virus. So that doesn't make a lot of sense. So what does make more sense is let's take what we've learned about the virus and let's use that in conjunction with our logic and common sense in terms of reopening the economy so that people can have a livelihood.
Mm-hmm. It's funny. At the beginning, I think before the last 4 weeks or so, I had the concern that people wouldn't take it seriously. I felt like maybe 6 weeks ago people weren't taking it seriously. And I even on television said, the problem is we're the land of the free and home of the brave. We're not used to being told what to do. There's some other countries where maybe they're more accustomed to it, where you could take more draconian measures, and people here just won't do it. But after being trained, if you will, by you and everybody else who worked so hard in the federal government to train us, I see now everybody's walking around with masks. They're taking it very, very seriously. So hopefully people won't get reckless as they go back. So assuming they don't, assuming they still take this seriously, but we start to open up again, when you consider all the factors, you consider testing, you consider treatment, you consider this infection curve, do you really believe that we can reopen in stages without having a significant probability of having another setback, a major setback?
Yeah, absolutely. If in fact we do that, and that's a big if. But I recognize that we're also going to be paying very careful attention to the various localities as they open up. And if we see signs of spiking, significant attention will be directed to them immediately. We won't really allow it to get out of hand. And that's something else that's been learned, during these last few months.
So in the lag time, by time your statistics actually show that an area is spiking, is that about a 2-week lag time or so by the time you get that data and then can actually take action on it, would you think?
Or less, 2 weeks or less. Because obviously everybody's going to be at a heightened attention. So things are going to come to light a lot faster than they did the first time around.
I've got to think this is the most difficult thing that President Trump has had to do so far in his time as president. I kind of, when I think about him trying to make these decisions, at the end of the day, he's trying to make a decision with the economy versus human lives. And it's so hard because you can't put a dollar value on human lives. But even then, to be fair, you have to think about, what will the mortality rate be if people are locked up in their houses for another 6 months? The depression rate, the suicide rate. So there's no easy equation here. And when I think of the president trying to make this decision, I think of that famous video when President Bush, the second President Bush, was in office, when he was in with a bunch of school children, and somebody came in and whispered in his ear that the World Trade Center just got attacked. That has to be how the president's feeling right now to a certain degree, that same type of pressure.
Well, not only that, but having done such a magnificent job at getting the economy in a very strong position, and that was something he really loved to talk about, and then to see it all crumble before your eyes. You know, for one thing, it does bring some degree of humility because you realize that you can't control everything. But he has really, I think, stepped up to the plate and responded well, recognizing, and I've talked to him about this, that no matter what he does, he's going to be severely criticized. So what you have to really do is what is right. Do the right thing. And in the long run, that's what's going to work.
Yeah, and the problem is with this kind of thing, because it's not formulaic per se, there's all this gray area, you're never 100% sure you're doing the right thing. And then also, you're never 100% sure what kind of spin the history books are going to put on it after the fact. So we need to take a quick commercial break. Dr. Carson, if you'll please stay with us. I want to have you back in our next segment. And you stay with us too. We'll be back here in just a moment, coming up on the income generation. We'll be right back. Now it's time to bring back Secretary of Housing and Urban Development, Dr. Ben Carson. Dr. Carson, thanks so much for sticking around.
My pleasure.
So the CARES Act has helped a lot of individuals. It's helped small businesses. It's gotten funded now a second time with an additional tranche of money just a couple of weeks ago. Do you think that more will eventually have to be done by Congress as we go through this reopening of the economy?
Well, the principle that we have to keep in mind is that this whole thing started on the back of an extraordinarily strong economy. This is very different than 2008, which was on the back of a very weak economy. So what we have to do is bridge the gap. We have to make sure that we keep the economic infrastructure strong enough so that when we have gotten past the bulk of this epidemic, we can resume activity. Now, some things will be destroyed. It's sort of like a forest fire. Comes in there, a lot of the underbrush is burnt off. But it does provide an opportunity for a lot of other things to spring up. And they'll spring up a lot faster because the fundamentals of the economy are solid.
Okay. Now, I know also that as Secretary of HUD, you've been really an advocate for perhaps some of the poorer folks in our country that really, because sometimes their housing is such that they can't socially distance in the way that a lot of us can, so they're more exposed. What are some of the special things that you've been able to do for them?
Well, we have really focused on the affordability of housing because that is what is causing the big problem. That's why people don't have choices, because things are so expensive. They're all congregated in one area. So that's why a lot of our policies are now directed at finding ways to remove the obstacles that keep us from being able to use, quite frankly, a lot of very ingenious inventions. We're an innovative society. And, some of the tiny houses, the modular houses, the 3D printable houses, the accessory dwelling units. There's a whole host of fabulous things that are actually quite nice that cannot be utilized because of some of the regulatory barriers. We're in the process of trying to remove those barriers and provide people with the opportunity to be able to use them. And, you even look at a lot of the millennials who are having difficulty being able to buy something because it's so expensive. But they would be able to afford, let's say, a manufactured house that has 2 or 3 bedrooms, 2 bathrooms. Actually, pretty nice. Doesn't look anything like a trailer.
Yeah, I've seen some of those. They are surprisingly nice. They really are.
And they accumulate value just as fast as a site-built home. So you can use that as your starter, and 5 years later,
Sure.
move on up.
That's right. So let me ask you this. With any crisis, obviously people learn lessons because there's really no playbook for a crisis or a black swan event, as I like to call this. What do you think is the most important learning that perhaps you in the White House had trying to manage this crisis over the last 8 weeks?
Oh boy, that's a loaded question. There's a lot of things to be learned, but I'll tell you the thing that for me has been the most impressive is that when I look at the areas that are successful, they tend to be places where you have cooperation between federal, state, and local governments, where they're not fighting each other and trying to demonize each other. And, that's one thing that really characterized the rapid rise of this nation. People were actually willing to work together and they saw us as a united group. And now we've seen so much splintering and so much hatred and people who are vying for power and they don't care what happens uh, around them. And those are things that the American people are the only ones who can solve. They're going to have to start thinking for themselves and not allowing themselves to be manipulated.
Even in times of crisis, the fact that, as Rodney King had famously said, can't we all just get along? Well, it seems like we can't get along even in times of a crisis. So, okay, I think I have it. The biggest risk is that maybe people go back to their normal lives and they no longer take this as seriously. They stop social distancing. They stop wearing masks. The good news is the government is poised, the White House is poised to act quickly in whatever measures they need to take if we do see a second wave of infections. That's all great. 30 seconds, final question. 4 years ago right now, there was as good of a possibility that you were sitting in the White House as President Trump. 30 seconds, tell us, if you were sitting in the White House in his spot, is there any one thing you would have done just a little differently over the last
Well,
2 months?
He always says to me, Ben, aren't you glad you didn't win? And I have to admit the answer to that is yes, because I'm not sure that I would have the patience to push back the way that he does. And you can't just allow these people to run roughshod of you. I think he's the right person to be there at the right time.
It's funny. You're kind of like me. You're a little too polite. And the great thing about the president is he's not afraid to say what's on his mind, and that's why the voters love him. So, Dr. Carson,
Exactly.
thanks so much for your time today. I really appreciate it.
Thank you so much.
And you stay with us, too. We have a lot more coming up in just a moment right here on The Income Generation. We'll be right back.